With the world focusing all of its attention on the ongoing battle for the presidency in the United States, it seems that the issue of climate change, carbon emissions, and the environment has been put on the back burner. Yet, has the world forgotten about the devastating effect of global warming? Reports emanating from global NGO Oxfam have stated that the world's richest 1% have caused double the amount of emissions than the poorest 50% of the planet, with CO2 emissions alone rising by 60% over 25 years, heating the planet and bringing with it devastating consequences.
The fire was only on this little corner of the roof, and then I raced down, found a fire truck, and they came up. But by the time they got all set up, the building was pretty much consumed, and it ended up a total loss. So it's a real shame. You know, I put my heart and soul into this project. We took almost 15 years to build this project. It's my dream castle, my dream.
The arrival of the coronavirus has had its own unique impact on global emissions, with lockdowns across big cities seeing a significant reduction in CO2 and pollutants from vehicles. But in the long term, will the current slowdown of emissions make any difference? Or is this dip we are currently enjoying simply the lull before the storm?
I think over time, it'll all even out anyway. We're still emitting CO2. So even if we have slightly less emission than usual, it's not like we're not emitting anything. We're still emitting huge amounts of CO2. So a 10% reduction in that, we're still emitting gigantic amounts of CO2 anyway. So would we even notice?
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Omid Roshandel, once again standing in for Kavit Hawaii over the next few weeks. On this week's episode, we will be focusing on the ongoing climate change affair and examining whether the impact of the COVID-19 on the economy also has a direct and proportional effect on global emissions, as well as looking at how well we are prepared to deal with climate change in a post-pandemic future. Don't forget, this is your show and we want to hear from you, so make sure you get in touch with us via our Twitter page using the marker ed_program. We promise to get back to all our viewers who send us their thoughts. And remember, we want to hear about the stories that matter to you, so do write in. Much like in many issues covered here on Economic Divide, there is a rich-poor gap when it comes to global emissions, with 10% of the global population comprising of about 630 million people being responsible for about 52% of worldwide emissions, which is clearly unfair on the poorer communities around the world who have to pay the ultimate price. On the other end of the scale, the poorest 50% of the world population, equating to around 3.1 billion people, are responsible for a mere 7% of cumulative emissions, using only 4% of the so-called global carbon budget, which is the recommended figure of just how much carbon emissions are suitable. And that clearly is a huge divide, I'm sure you all agree. But did you know that there is an even thinner divide right at the top of the social ladder, with the world's richest 1% of people equating again to around 63 million people, contributing to a whopping 15% of global cumulative emissions, which, as you just saw in the previous graphic, is more than double the amount produced by 3.1 billion people, raising the question as to just how can such a problem be resolved.
There's no doubt that the arrival of the coronavirus at the start of the year has changed the way people live and work in a way not seen before in history, with major cities in the world falling silent as lockdown conditions force people to stay at home, bring transport to an almost non-existent standstill, and sees factories cut their production lines to almost zero. The result of this extreme measure to stop the spread of the virus has also had a direct and proportionate effect on the environment, with major cities around the world all seeing the benefit of less traffic, less pollution, and clean air, with cities such as Mumbai, Beijing, Paris, and New York all experiencing all-time levels of clean air.
So in New York, a lot of what we're seeing for the air quality side is transit driven, so transport vehicles, and the number of vehicles on the roads here dropped by, I think, nearly a third over the space of 3 days. So the emissions that we're seeing from vehicles has gone way down. It's not completely zero. There's still a lot of trucks on the road.
Naturally, one of the largest reductions in pollution and carbon emissions has come from the lack of traffic on the roads, with once bustling cities appearing to be the shell of their former selves, in particular in cities such as Paris, London and Madrid, all of which have not only seen their traffic reduced, but even public transport being run on a skeletal schedule. However, the question is whether COVID-19 has actually done the environment a favour, as there is a flip side to the argument. One negative consequence of the virus is the exponential increase in the use of disposable plastics, with items such as gloves, shields, cups, plates and cutlery all being used once across a range of places, hence seeing an increase in plastic refuse building up, which, as we all know, tends to end up in the sea and tends to have a dire effect on marine life and water quality. What now remains to be seen are the lessons that can be learned from the reduction in emissions that have come from the virus, and hence allows us to question whether major cities will simply return to normal in the future or attempt to maintain the green, eco-friendly conditions that they currently enjoy.
So just how big is the global carbon emissions problem? Let's take a look at some of the figures. Globally, humans produce over 40 billion tons of CO2 every year, rising at a steady rate of around 1% per year. 41 of the world's countries emit more than 100 million tons each, hence making them the lion's share of global emissions, comprising of around 90% of the total. So just who are the guilty parties when it comes to CO2 emissions? According to a Statista, China is by far the largest CO2 producer in the world, with around 27.5% of the world's output, followed by the United States on 14.8%, India at 7.6%, and the Russian Federation at 4.6%. However, there is some light at the end of the tunnel. A growing number of countries are setting targets to end their contribution to carbon emissions altogether, with China pledging the act by the year 2060, California planning to be carbon-free by 2045, Japan is stating as soon as possible, and the European Union by 2050. Strangely, the United States has not made any promises to cut CO2 emissions under Donald Trump.
One of the most scrutinised industries in the world when it comes to having a heavy carbon footprint is the aviation industry. Yet once again, much like in the case of cities and towns coming to a standstill during the lockdown, so too has this industry, which has seen millions of dollars lost, thousands of aircraft grounded, hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, and some airlines on the verge of bankruptcy, or worse still for some, seeing them go out of business. However, since the lockdown, demand for air travel has also reduced, with passenger figures down 52%, which in numbers equates to a reduction of nearly 3 billion less seats being sold compared to 2019, as well as around 60% less air traffic across Europe, Africa and the Americas, and 70% across Asia. This of course has also led to a significant reduction in carbon emissions, which has caused the airlines and aviation industry to do some serious thinking as to how they're going to emerge from the pandemic. It's been agreed by many that the aviation industry will take years to return to its once former glory, with analysts expecting passengers to be prudent for many years to come. However, should a vaccine arrive, a boost to the industry is very much needed. Hence in step Airbus, who have announced that they're planning to introduce an entire fleet of hydrogen-fueled aircraft, promising zero emissions, and could be hitting the skies in as little as just 15 years. Although the inevitable race to green air travel with Boeing that will ensue may make this time much quicker in reality, with majestic and iconic aircraft such as the Airbus A380 seeing its last ever unit completed in Toulouse just this month, and the Boeing 747 also being largely retired by major airlines around the world. Could then the announcement of the hydrogen-fueled project by Airbus hence be the catalyst to return the global airlines and aviation industry back into the golden, or in this case the green, era that it once was?
It's a pleasure to welcome onto the show today Paul Ekins, a professor of resources and environment policy at University College London. He was the co-chair of the United Nations Global Environment Outlook published in 2019 and was awarded an OBE in the New Year's Honors List for services to environmental policy. Professor Ekins, many thanks for joining us here today on Economic Divide.
My pleasure to be with you.
Well, the whole purpose of our show here today is to send a reminder to our viewers that in spite of world attention being heavily focused on the U.S. elections, there are still huge environmental issues that need to be addressed around the world, with a recent report from Oxfam stating that the richest 1% around the world have double the emissions of the poorest half of the world. So why is climate change and environment finding itself on the back burner once again by global leaders?
Well, inevitably, when other things happen, priorities are readjusted, and we are living through the most awful pandemic globally, which has killed more than 1 million people and is still killing very many people around the world. So I'm not surprised that is the subject of most of the headlines.
Well, it is, of course, important to maintain a sustainable economy, especially in the face of the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. So what lessons can be learned from the outbreak's impact on the economy and environment, and how should states and organizations emerge from the pandemic in terms of maintaining the balance of growth and environmental awareness?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I've said, the pandemic is a terrible tragedy, and it's horrible that it should have happened. But in a ironic sort of way, it has provided us with a huge opportunity, because in the recovery from the pandemic, governments are planning to spend sums of money which are simply eye-watering and which they would never, ever have thought of spending in the absence of the pandemic. What is now absolutely critical is that these sums of money go to reinforce moves towards a zero-carbon economy, rather than trying to prop up the old economy, which of course is based on fossil fuels. The investment opportunities are absolutely enormous in new electricity systems, in new transport vehicles, in new propulsion systems of all kinds, in new infrastructures. So there's a huge industrial opportunity. And if these coronavirus recovery funds are spent sensibly, they can both support a new wave of economic growth, which is obviously important, and create the jobs that are required, and get us well on the way towards our zero carbon ambitions.
One of the world's worst hit economies during the COVID-19 was the aviation industry, with many seeking heavy bailouts and loans, with, of course, a few collapsing. In terms of the impact on the environment, many are relieved that air traffic has diminished. Yet, as we progress, Airbus has announced plans to launch a series of hydrogen-fueled passenger aircraft with a zero-emission policy. Could these kind of initiatives be what is needed to reignite the aviation economy, and could we see other industries following suit?
Well, again, I mean, as with the pandemic more generally, nothing concentrates minds more than a really existential shock. And obviously, my heart goes out to all those in the aviation industry whose lives have been disrupted and whose jobs have disappeared. But if the result of that is that the aviation industry starts taking much more seriously the need to change to zero carbon fuels, then at least that's a silver lining, which will in due course allow the industry to recover sustainably and to re-employ old staff or employ new staff to give us the mobility that we want. And I think it's enormously exciting that Airbus has taken this initiative with hydrogen. I've been studying hydrogen at university for at least 20 years, and it's been quite slow taking off, but it's just this sort of large-scale industrial initiative that is required in order really to take not just aviation, but all sorts of other sectors in similar sorts of ways through innovation to the zero carbon place where we need to be.
Professor Paul Ekins from UCL, many thanks for being with us today. Great to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming right up. We are joined by journalist and researcher Atife Padidar as she takes us through what is being discussed on social media. We take a look at other economic headlines hitting the front pages in our regular Info News section, and we also look at how climate change is having an impact on the people of California, where wildfires have torn through the state, all whilst U.S. President Donald Trump denies that climate change exists altogether. We also take a look at how climate protests are still being conducted in spite of lockdowns and coronavirus risks. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short message. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Omid Roshandal. Time now to take a look at some of the big economic news stories hitting the front pages across the world. Our first stop is right here in the Islamic Republic of Iran. The U.S. has announced that 18 Iranian banks would be sanctioned. Tehran has accused Washington of economic terrorism, accusing the U.S. of trying to prevent humanitarian goods and supplies, including medicines, from reaching Iran. China has ramped up digital currency pilot testing with transactions topping 1.1 billion yuan. This is part of a series of ongoing pilot programs in major cities, which shows in part how China is serious in moving away from the dollar currency. And in the U.S., the tug-of-war over the proposed COVID-19 stimulus continues. In the latest news, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has rejected increased U.S. stimulus offer, saying the White House offer falls short on coronavirus testing, worker safety, and child care. The proposed stimulus from the Republicans is around $1.8 trillion. Now, our next report focuses on one of the consequences of global warming and changing weather conditions as we take a look at the economic impact of the wildfires raging across California.
President Trump appears to have shot himself in the foot on numerous occasions. One, with his claim of COVID-19 not being caught by everyone, yet seeing him catch it himself, and the other in his claims that global warming is made up, whilst he sees the United States' most prosperous state, California, continuing to see wildfires burning through its dry tundra, causing billions in damage as the fires rage on. To date, over 4 million acres have succumbed to the fires, wiping out homes, land, crops and infrastructure as it makes its way across the land fueled by high winds, no rain and dry terrain. One such fire in the state has now exceeded 1 million acres alone and has earned the label of a gigafire. So far, 31 people have lost their lives in the fires of this year alone, and the financial costs of the fires have been estimated to be in around $25 billion. With the price increasing to $85 billion when factoring in other costs.
I've seen significant change. The change, especially within the last couple of years, has been much more devastating. The loss of life has just been incredible. And every year they'll say, hey, we lost a handful of lives, 50 lives, 80 lives, 100 lives.
For Trump, there's also no escaping the fact that global warming has played a major role in the fires. In spite of several thunderstorms in the area, very little rain has fallen during these storms, yet over 11,000 lightning strikes have hit, many of which, when hitting the dry land, are believed to have been the cause of many new fires. Add to the fact that the smoke from the fires in California can be seen from space, then the effect of the smoke as a major pollutant is also a serious concern for safety in itself, as the carbon monoxide released from the burning wood and organic material is adding to the poor air quality in the region, hence adding a second layer of grief to an already desperate situation.
Time now to welcome onto the show our researcher and journalist, Atife Padidar, as she takes us through some of her findings on social media. Atife, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I know that you've been keeping a close eye on social media regarding the topic at hand, which is climate change, global warming, and carbon emissions. So tell us what you've got for us.
Well, people were expressing a lot of concern about the effects of carbon emission on health. For example, our first tweet, if we take a look at it, it's by Rose O'Neill. She is quoting an NGO, shows that climate change, deforestation, and carbon emissions are major issues that are damaging children's health.
Some countries are taking measures to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide they're emitting to the atmosphere. To what extent do you think these measures can be hopeful to save the generations to come?
Well, I guess, first of all, world leaders need to believe that it's happening, and then they take useful measures. Let's go to our next tweet,
Sure.
which is by B. It says, by 2070, 50 years from now, over 4 million Americans are going to be displaced as a result of climate crisis, and if our carbon emission continue to rise at this level. Imagine if 4 million Americans are going to be homeless 50 years from now.
I've got a question for you first. I can't quite find the link between being displaced and carbon emissions.
if the climate crisis continues this way, we're going to have more glacial melts and the rivers come up, and there's going to be a lot of people who get homeless. So
who's going to pay the ultimate price? I guess
people.
Yeah.
Our final tweet is from Sophie. She is actually quoting an article on BBC which says that overpopulation is a major factor for the rise of carbon emission. And she's slamming that article actually. She says that there's actually 100 companies that are responsible for 31% of world carbon emissions. She's saying that these mega companies like oil industries and businesses like that are putting the blame on overpopulation simply to just turn the attention from what they're doing to the earth.
Oh, 71%, that's huge.
Yeah.
Atifat, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Now, our last report today looks at how, in spite of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, some groups around the world are still protesting about climate change, with groups like Extinction Rebellion as active as ever as they raise awareness around the world.
Many nations around the world are seeing their residents taking to the streets following over 10 months of economic and social uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 virus, with many protesting against the notion of lockdowns. Yet even during these challenging times, many environmental groups have taken to the streets to continue their campaigns against climate change, with Extinction Rebellion in London being one fine example of such a protest. During the height of the COVID crisis, Extinction Rebellion took to the streets of London in September to raise awareness and saw dozens of their group arrested by the Metropolitan Police Service as they blocked Parliament Square in the heart of London. Protesters specifically targeted the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson as they faced £10,000 fines for breaching social distancing rules in order to raise awareness of the so-called HS2 or high-speed train line that's due to see London linked with the North Midlands, cutting through miles and miles of unspoiled nature in the process.
We're supposed to be giving something better to our children in the future, but instead our actions right now are taking away their future. So I feel that as a parent and as a citizen of the world, I have the responsibility, I have the moral duty to act. I've sent petitions, I've gone on marches, I've done everything the nice way, and emissions continue to rise. So we've taken to the streets until they listen.
What's evident is that in spite of the challenging times that coronavirus has brought the world, people are still determined to protect the long-term future of the planet, as no doubt the COVID-19 virus will one day eventually subside, and as demonstrated by our previous show, in which we featured the case of the Nairobi National Park in Kenya. If you work hard enough to raise awareness of a cause, you may just win in the end. What now remains to be seen is how the world wakes up following the pandemic, and whether the lessons learned today will be applied accordingly tomorrow.
Whereas an election will deem how a certain country is run for the next few years, the problem surrounding climate change is an issue that will affect people for generations to come. Yet it seems, however, that people around the world, especially the richest deciles, are only interested in the short term as they put profits before people. With global warming a real thing, the millions of dollars worth of damage being caused in wildfires in California, not to mention the cost it has on the environment, flora, fauna, and animals of the area, are all having a major impact. Yet, this is something that President Trump, for one, denies as a result of climate change. Yet the future may not all be bleak, as projects such as the Airbus hydrogen-fueled aircraft and nations claiming they will aim to be carbon-free in the next few decades is a sign that people are beginning to wake up to the realities of climate change, hence showing that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Now you can watch this episode of Economic Divide again simply by logging onto our website and clicking on shows, or you can catch numerous episodes and teasers of the program by visiting our Twitter page by using the marker ED_program. Don't forget to leave us a comment. We promise to get back to all our viewers. That's just about all the time we have for this week's show. I've been Omid Roshandel, and on behalf of myself and the whole team right here on Economic Divide, many thanks for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you next week.